At 3:39 in the morning local time on July 19th, the United States military launched multiple projectiles at the construction site of Iran's Darkhovin nuclear power plant in Khuzestan province, roughly 70 kilometers south of Avaz and about 100 kilometers north of the Persian Gulf. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization confirmed the strike within hours, calling it, in its own words, an aggressive and brutal act contrary to international law. That single strike on a facility that had been under construction since December of 2022 and was still years away from producing a single watt of power marked the 8th consecutive night of American strikes on Iran. And it represented something genuinely new in this already sprawling war, the first time a nuclear-designated site had formally entered the target list since this current round of fighting reignited back in February. Within hours of that strike landing, the entire region lit up in a way that made clear just how interconnected every part of this conflict had become. Kuwait accused Iran of hitting its power and desalination plant for the second time in as many days, causing a fire at a facility the government explicitly described as civilian and vital. Jordan reported an attack on a base hosting American forces, with Iranian state television claiming 2 American fighter aircraft had been destroyed. Bahrain came under renewed drone and missile fire targeting its own infrastructure, and the American embassy in Jordan ordered the evacuation of Aqba's international airport and seaport over what it called a specific and credible threat. In the span of about 24 hours, 4 countries across the Gulf found themselves directly under fire, all traceable back to a single American strike on a nuclear construction site that, by every available account, didn't even contain any nuclear material at the time. Stick around, because we're going to walk through exactly what happened at Darkhovin, why hitting an undeclared, unfinished nuclear facility is such a different kind of escalation than anything that's come before it in this war, what triggered the wave of retaliation that swept across Kuwait, Jordan, and Bahrain in response, and why the International Atomic Energy Agency and the broader international community are treating this specific strike as a genuinely dangerous new threshold, regardless of how limited the physical damage might have actually turned out to be. If you're finding this kind of detailed, fact-based breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a like. It genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people trying to understand exactly what's happening, instead of just catching fragments of headlines, and subscribe if you haven't already, because this war keeps producing exactly this kind of consequential, fast-moving story. Let's talk about what Darkhovin actually is, because understanding the facility itself, its history, and its actual intended purpose is essential to understanding why striking it mattered so much to so many different observers watching from around the world, not just to Iran and the United States directly involved in the fighting. Construction on the site began in December 2022, situated along the Karun River in Khuzestan province, close enough to the Iraqi border that it sits firmly within the western edge of Iran's nuclear infrastructure network. The plant was designed to eventually house a domestically built reactor with a generating capacity somewhere between 300 and 360 megawatts, using a pressurized water reactor system at an estimated total cost of around $2 billion. With construction projected to take roughly 8 years from start to finish. That timeline alone tells you something important. As of the night it was struck, Darkhovin wasn't remotely close to being operational. It had also faced years of delays even before becoming a military target, including China's earlier withdrawal of its planned reactor designs for the project, leaving Iran to continue construction largely on its own. Compare that profile to the sites that had already been struck earlier in this broader conflict, and the contrast becomes genuinely stark. Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan were active operational facilities central to Iran's actual enrichment capability, holding real quantities of enriched material and functioning centrifuges at the time American and Israeli strikes hit them. Darkhovin, by comparison, was a years-away foundation and framework construction project, the kind of site that, in any other context, wouldn't register as a meaningful military target at all. That gap between what Darkhovin actually represented in practical terms and the symbolic weight of striking anything carrying the label nuclear facility is exactly what makes this specific strike worth examining so closely, because it suggests the campaign's targeting logic had shifted from eliminating active enrichment capability toward something closer to demonstrating that no site associated with Iran's nuclear ambitions, however distant from actual production, would be considered off-limits going forward. The International Atomic Energy Agency, in its own statement following the strike, confirmed it was investigating reports of the overnight attack, and crucially noted that the facility remained in the very early stages of construction and contained no nuclear material at the time inspectors had last visited. That detail matters enormously because it means this specific strike, unlike the earlier attacks on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, didn't carry any meaningful risk of a radiological incident of any kind. There was no enriched uranium stockpile sitting inside Darkhovin waiting to be scattered by a missile strike. But the absence of nuclear material at the site doesn't make the strike itself any less significant from a legal and precedent-setting standpoint. And that's exactly the argument Iran has been making forcefully to anyone who will listen since the moment the missiles landed. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Kazem Garibabadi, described the attack on Darkhovin as a dangerous assault on Iran's civilian infrastructure, and promised that Iran would respond to defend its national security. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization went even further rhetorically, describing Darkhovin as a symbol of the Iranian nation's dignity and its efforts to achieve self-reliance, language clearly designed to frame the strike not just as a military action, but as an attack on Iranian national identity itself. And Iran didn't stop at angry statements. Its permanent representative to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Iravani, sent a formal letter to the President of the Security Council and the UN Secretary General, denouncing the strike as a flagrant violation of international law and specifically calling on the Security Council to reaffirm what Iran describes as a long-standing international consensus that armed attacks, or even threats of attack, against peaceful nuclear facilities are unacceptable under any circumstances. That letter cited numerous prior IAEA General Conference resolutions and Security Council statements reaffirming the inviolability of nuclear installations operating under international safeguards. It's worth noting how quickly and how formally Iran moved on the diplomatic front here, because it reveals a deliberate strategic choice about which battles to fight, through which channels. Rather than simply issuing another round of retaliatory strikes and letting the moment pass the way so many previous escalations in this war have played out, Iran's government invested real diplomatic capital in elevating this specific strike to the level of the United Nations Security Council, explicitly framing it as a matter of international nuclear law rather than just another skirmish in an already sprawling conventional war. That choice suggests Iranian leadership recognized something genuinely different about this particular target, understanding that the symbolic and legal weight of striking anything associated with its nuclear program carries far more potential value on the international stage than protesting the destruction of yet another missile bunker or coastal radar site ever could, regardless of how much actual military significance any individual target holds. Here's where things get genuinely complicated from a legal standpoint, because Iran's argument isn't baseless, even if you set aside every other dimension of this broader conflict. There is a real, long-standing body of international consensus, built up over decades specifically to prevent exactly this kind of scenario, holding that nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards should be treated as off-limits to military strikes precisely because of the catastrophic potential consequences if something goes wrong. Safeguards agreements exist to give international inspectors access to declared nuclear sites and to generate verification reports for the agency's board, confirming that nuclear material isn't being diverted toward weapons development. What those safeguards don't do, and this is the critical distinction, is actually prevent a military strike from happening in the first place. Whether a safeguarded site gets struck or not remains entirely a matter of state conduct and Security Council politics, not something the inspection regime itself has any power to block. Darkhovin, even in its unfinished state, was formally declared and subject to that same IAEA safeguards framework, which is exactly why Iran is leaning so heavily on the language of international nuclear law in its response, rather than simply treating this as one more strike among dozens that have already hit the country. That verification gap is worth understanding a little more precisely because it explains why the IAEA's role throughout this entire episode has been limited to investigating and confirming rather than actually preventing anything. The agency's inspectors can visit a declared site, catalog what materials and equipment are present, and issue reports documenting compliance, or non-compliance with safeguards obligations, but nothing in that mandate gives the IAEA any enforcement mechanism capable of physically stopping a member state's military from striking a facility it has decided, for its own strategic reasons, needs to be destroyed or degraded. That structural limitation has been on full display throughout this entire war, from the original strikes on Fordow and Natanz all the way through to Darkhovin, and it's a limitation that non-proliferation advocates have pointed to repeatedly as one of the more troubling revelations of this entire conflict, regardless of which side of the underlying dispute over Iran's nuclear ambitions any particular observer happens to favor. The international reaction beyond Iran's own government has been telling in its own right. The Indian embassy in Tehran, within hours of the strike being confirmed, urged its nationals to postpone all travel to Iran and encouraged those already in the country to consider leaving, citing a sharp rise in instability. That's a meaningful signal. India wasn't reacting to troop movements or missile exchanges it had seen dozens of times already throughout this conflict. It was reacting specifically to the fact that a safeguarded nuclear site, regardless of how early stage or empty of actual nuclear material it happened to be, had entered the target set of a war that was already 5 months old at that point. For a government managing the safety of its own citizens abroad, that shift in what's considered fair game changes the entire risk calculation for anyone with people or interests anywhere near the Gulf, because it suggests the boundaries that had previously constrained this conflict were continuing to erode in real time. Now let's rewind about 10 days, because this Darkhovin strike didn't happen in isolation, and understanding what came before it makes the escalation feel a lot less sudden and a lot more like the continuation of a pattern that had already been building for weeks. On the night of July 8th, explosions were heard in the Iranian city of Bushehr, along with reports of blasts in Konarak and Chogadak in the country's south. Bushehr is home to Iran's only operating civilian nuclear power plant, a Russian-built facility that's been generating electricity for the national grid for years. According to Iranian state media, 2 projectiles hit a military base south of Bushehr that same night, and while a provincial security official confirmed the strike, Iran's Noor news agency, which is affiliated with the country's Supreme National Security Council, specifically stated that the power plant itself had not been damaged in the attack. That distinction, a military site near the plant being struck while the actual reactor complex was spared, mattered enormously at the time, because it suggested the campaign was still respecting an unspoken boundary around Iran's one functioning nuclear facility, even while conducting strikes in the immediate vicinity. That same day, speaking at the NATO summit being held in Turkey, President Trump renewed an explicit threat to target critical civilian infrastructure inside Iran, specifically raising the possibility of striking electric plants and desalination plants directly. "I don't want to do that," he told reporters, "but if we have to, we'll take them out." That statement landed as a genuinely significant escalation in the administration's public rhetoric, because targeting critical civilian infrastructure like water and power plants sits in exactly the kind of legally contested territory that international humanitarian law experts have flagged repeatedly throughout this conflict. Infrastructure serving civilian populations, even when it has some tangential military value, carries real legal risk when it becomes a deliberate target. And that risk is exactly why some legal analysts have specifically noted that this kind of targeting could be considered a war crime under the laws of armed conflict, depending on how directly any individual strike can be tied to legitimate military necessity versus simply inflicting broad, punishing pressure on the civilian population and economy. It's worth sitting with that NATO summit comment for a moment because of how directly it foreshadowed everything that followed. Trump wasn't talking about missile bunkers or drone storage facilities when he made that threat. He was talking specifically about the kind of infrastructure that keeps drinking water flowing and electricity running for ordinary Iranian families who have no direct role in the regime's decision-making. And just 11 days later, American missiles were landing on a nuclear facility construction site, a target that, while not technically a desalination or electric plant in the way Trump had specifically described, sits squarely within that same broader category of infrastructure that touches Iran's civilian and national identity far more directly than a missile bunker buried in a mountainside ever could. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because this NATO summit comment didn't emerge in a vacuum. It arrived on the heels of months of steadily expanding target categories throughout this war, moving from purely military infrastructure toward increasingly civilian-adjacent targets, a trajectory that included the earlier bridge and power plant doctrine explicitly tying any Iranian attack on shipping to a guaranteed strike on a specific piece of Iranian infrastructure. Each step along that progression has followed a similar logic, framing civilian-facing infrastructure as a legitimate lever of pressure precisely because it touches ordinary daily life in a way that purely military losses often don't, even while that same logic continues drawing sharper criticism from humanitarian and legal observers concerned about where exactly the line between military necessity and collective punishment actually sits. Watching that same expanding target logic extend for the first time onto something carrying the specific label of nuclear facility, however early in construction, represents a genuinely new chapter in that broader pattern rather than simply another data point along an already familiar trajectory. Let's talk about what happened across the wider region once Iran decided to respond to the Darkhovin strike, because this is where the phrase Middle East on fire genuinely starts to earn its place in the story, rather than reading as pure hyperbole dreamed up for a headline. Kuwait's government said Iran had struck its power and desalination plant for the second time in as many days, describing the facility explicitly as civilian and vital infrastructure and accusing Tehran of deliberately targeting exactly that kind of installation. A fire broke out at the site as a result. Kuwait's army separately confirmed it had intercepted additional Iranian missiles and drones that same day, following what officials described as sustained attacks that had begun the day before. Jordan reported that Iran had destroyed at least 2 American fighter aircraft during a missile and drone attack targeting a base hosting United States forces, according to Iranian state television's own account of the strike. And the American embassy in Jordan moved quickly to order the evacuation of Aqaba's international airport and seaport, citing what it specifically called a credible and specific threat, urging all Americans to avoid both locations entirely and to continue following every directive issued by Jordanian security authorities. Bahrain, meanwhile, absorbed its own wave of renewed drone activity targeting infrastructure across the country, adding a 4th nation to the list of countries directly under fire within roughly a single day. Think about the geography involved here for a second, because it underscores just how far this specific escalation cycle actually spread. Kuwait sits at the northern tip of the Gulf, Bahrain sits roughly in the middle along the Arabian coastline, and Jordan sits entirely outside the Gulf altogether, bordering Iraq and Israel on the opposite side of the Arabian Peninsula. Iran reaching that far outward, hitting a partner nation with no direct maritime connection to the Strait of Hormuz whatsoever, in direct response to a single strikes on an unfinished nuclear construction site, tells you just how broadly this regime is now willing to retaliate whenever it perceives an American action as crossing a line it considers unacceptable. Each of these 3 governments occupies a genuinely difficult position in this broader conflict, hosting American military infrastructure or maintaining close security relationships with Washington, while sitting geographically close enough to Iran that they've repeatedly absorbed direct retaliatory strikes throughout this war, strikes their own populations had no role in provoking. Kuwait's decision to publicly and explicitly accuse Iran of deliberately targeting civilian and vital infrastructure, rather than simply reporting the attack in more neutral terms, reflects a government growing increasingly frustrated with repeatedly finding itself in the crossfire of a conflict fundamentally between 2 other parties. Jordan's evacuation order for a major airport and seaport over a specific and credible threat represents an extraordinary disruption to ordinary civilian and commercial life, the kind of precautionary measure that carries real economic cost, even when, as often happens, the specific threat doesn't ultimately materialize into an actual strike at that exact location. And Bahrain, hosting significant American naval infrastructure of its own, faces a similar calculus every time the cycle of strike and retaliation flares up again, weighing its security relationship with Washington against the mounting domestic cost of repeatedly serving as a target for Iranian retaliation it never directly provoked. There's another target from that same general window worth mentioning, because it adds an entirely different dimension to how far-reaching this war's infrastructure targeting has become. The Akyu-Take-Khan railway bridge in Golestan province, in Iran's north, was reportedly struck around the same period, according to Fars news agency, which is run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That specific rail line matters well beyond its immediate military value, because it serves as a vital trade corridor connecting Tehran with its 2 most significant strategic partners, China and Russia, continuing onward through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan to form an important overland link toward China specifically. That corridor has taken on heightened significance this year precisely because of the ongoing blockade of Iran's Gulf ports, functioning as one of the few remaining paths Iran has left to move goods and maintain economic ties with its 2 largest remaining international partners, while its maritime routes remain squeezed. Striking that bridge, whether or not it was formally connected to the same operational window as the Darkhovin and Bushehr strikes, sends its own unmistakable signal about how comprehensively this campaign is targeting every avenue Iran has left for sustaining itself economically, not just its military capability. That specific target also carries implications well beyond Iran's own borders, because degrading the rail link connecting Tehran to Beijing and Moscow inevitably touches the interests of both of those larger powers as well, even indirectly. China has remained one of Iran's primary oil customers and economic lifelines throughout years of Western sanctions, and Russia has leaned on Iran for drone technology and broader military cooperation throughout its own ongoing war against Ukraine. A rail corridor connecting all 3 countries represents exactly the kind of infrastructure that keeps that triangular relationship functioning smoothly, and disrupting it, even through a single bridge strike, chips away at the practical mechanics of an alignment that both Washington and its regional partners have watched with growing concern throughout this entire conflict. Whether that specific strike was a deliberate signal aimed at Beijing and Moscow as much as it was aimed at degrading Iran's own logistics, or simply an incidental target that happened to sit along a strategically significant route, it's exactly the kind of development that adds yet another layer of international complexity to a war that already involves far more parties directly and indirectly than just the United States and Iran. There's also a leadership dimension running underneath all of this that adds real weight to why this specific moment in the war carries so much significance. Iran's supreme leader was killed in Israeli and American airstrikes back on February 28th, the same day this current phase of the war began. His funeral procession took place in Karbala, Iraq, on July 9th, just one day after the Bush airstrikes, and Trump's NATO summit comments about targeting infrastructure. That timing places an enormous leadership transition happening in direct parallel with exactly the period when this war escalated towards striking nuclear-designated infrastructure for the first time since the conflict reignited. A country processing the death of its top leader, managing the transition to a new supreme leader, widely believed to hold more aggressive views on Iran's nuclear ambitions than his predecessor, while simultaneously absorbing a strike on a nuclear facility and retaliating across 4 separate countries within days, is a country under about as much simultaneous internal and external pressure as any modern government has faced in recent memory. That combination of pressures matters enormously for predicting how Iran's government is likely to behave going forward. A leadership transition, under normal circumstances, tends to produce a period of internal consolidation, with competing factions jockeying for influence and the new leader working to establish credibility both domestically and among the security apparatus, whose loyalty ultimately determines whether any Iranian leader can actually govern effectively. Layering an active, expanding, multi-front war directly on top of that kind of transition removes any breathing room the new leadership might otherwise have had to consolidate quietly. Every decision made during this period, including how forcefully to retaliate against strikes like the one on Darkhovin, gets filtered through the lens of a leadership that still needs to prove its own toughness and legitimacy to a domestic audience, watching closely for any sign of weakness, which may help explain why Iran's response to this specific strike was as immediate, as geographically wide-reaching, and as diplomatically forceful as it turned out to be. Let's be honest about the legal and strategic debate this specific strike has reopened, because it's genuinely more complicated than a simple question of whether the target had nuclear material present at the time it was hit. International law experts and non-proliferation advocates have spent decades building consensus around treating nuclear facilities, even ones far less operationally significant than Fordow or Natanz, as categorically different from conventional military targets, precisely because normalizing strikes against any facility bearing the nuclear label risks eroding the broader taboo that's helped prevent nuclear facilities from becoming routine battlefield targets throughout the nuclear age. Iran's own framing that this strike represents a flagrant violation of a long-standing international norm protecting peaceful nuclear installations taps directly into that broader concern, even though skeptics of Iran's position would point out that Darkhovin's civilian designation doesn't automatically exempt it from military targeting if credible intelligence suggested it served a purpose beyond simple electricity generation somewhere down the line. And even though the facility's location and construction timeline make it a considerably less urgent proliferation concern than the enrichment sites targeted in earlier phases of this conflict. That tension between the legitimate non-proliferation argument for treating nuclear-designated sites as off-limits regardless of their current operational status, and the legitimate military argument that a sprawling multi-front war doesn't leave room for permanently ring-fencing every facility that happens to carry a nuclear label somewhere in its name, is exactly the kind of unresolved dispute that's likely to keep generating exactly the sort of controversy every time a new site enters the target list going forward. It's also worth acknowledging honestly that the IAEA's own confirmation that no nuclear material was present at Darkhovin during its last inspection does meaningfully reduce the practical physical danger this specific strike posed compared to strikes on facilities actually holding enriched uranium stockpiles. But precedent and physical danger aren't the same thing, and the broader non-proliferation community's concern here is overwhelmingly about precedent, about what lesson other countries around the world draw from watching a formally declared IAEA safeguarded nuclear site get struck regardless of how early in construction it happened to be. Consider how this precedent might actually play out in practice for a country other than Iran, watching this entire episode unfold from a safe distance. A government somewhere else in the world weighing whether to formally declare a future nuclear energy project to the IAEA now has a very recent, very concrete example, suggesting that formal declaration and safeguard status offer essentially no protection against military strikes once a broader geopolitical relationship deteriorates far enough. That's precisely the kind of lesson non-proliferation experts have spent this entire conflict warning about, going all the way back to the original strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Every additional strike on anything carrying the nuclear label, regardless of how limited its actual capability or however early in construction it happens to be, reinforces that same lesson a little further, and reinforcing it repeatedly across an extended, multi-phase conflict like this one arguably does more lasting damage to the broader international non-proliferation framework than any single strike considered in isolation ever could. So where does this leave the broader trajectory of the war right now? The pattern that's emerged across this specific stretch of the conflict, escalating American strikes creeping closer to and eventually onto nuclear-designated infrastructure, met by immediate, wide-ranging Iranian retaliation against multiple regional partners simultaneously, suggests a conflict that's continuing to widen its geographic footprint even as it enters its fifth month. Every additional country pulled directly into the fighting, whether that's Kuwait absorbing fire damage to its power and desalination infrastructure, Jordan evacuating a major airport and seaport over credible threats, or Bahrain fending off renewed drone attacks, adds another government with its own domestic political pressures, its own relationship with Washington, and its own calculation about how much continued instability it's willing to tolerate before demanding a resolution one way or another. That regional pressure, layered on top of the direct American-Iranian standoff, creates exactly the kind of multi-party complexity that makes any clean, comprehensive resolution to this war increasingly difficult to achieve. Because ending the conflict now requires satisfying not just Washington and Tehran, but every regional government that's been dragged into absorbing damage along the way. It's worth remembering, too, that every one of these regional partners has its own domestic audience, watching how its government handles being repeatedly caught in the crossfire of a war it didn't start and doesn't ultimately control. Kuwaiti, Jordanian, and Bahraini leadership all face a version of the same pressure Tehran and Washington are managing internally, balancing security relationships and strategic alliances against a population increasingly exhausted by disruption, evacuations, and infrastructure damage tied to a conflict fundamentally between two other countries. That kind of cumulative regional fatigue doesn't necessarily produce dramatic policy shifts overnight, but it does create quiet, mounting pressure on every government involved to find some path toward de-escalation, even if the two primary combatants themselves show little immediate appetite for one. What's clear is that the specific threshold crossed at Darkhovin, striking a nuclear-designated facility, regardless of its construction status or the absence of nuclear material on site, represents exactly the kind of precedent that's likely to keep shaping how this war is fought and how it's perceived internationally going forward. Whether future strikes continue creeping closer to Iran's genuinely active and materially significant nuclear infrastructure, or whether this specific episode ends up standing as an isolated escalation that both sides quietly step back from repeating, will say a great deal about whether the remaining months of this conflict trend toward further widening or toward the kind of narrowing focus that might eventually make a negotiated resolution possible. Given everything we've already seen from this war's trajectory, its expanding infrastructure targets, its widening circle of regional participants, and its increasingly personal rhetoric on both sides, betting on restraint has not been a particularly reliable strategy so far, and there's little in the record of the last 5 months to suggest that's about to change without some genuinely new pressure entering the equation from one direction or another. What do you think this specific strike signals about where this war is actually headed? Do you think hitting Darkhovin, even an empty, under-construction facility, represents a genuine strategic escalation that changes the shape of this conflict? Or do you think it's more symbolic than substantive, given the IAEA's own confirmation that no nuclear material was actually present? Let us know what you think down in the comments. We read through every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into in future videos. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly how one strike on an unfinished nuclear site managed to pull 4 separate countries into direct conflict within a single day, do us a favor and hit like on this video, leave your take in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already, so you catch the next update the moment something shifts. This war keeps producing exactly this kind of fast-moving, consequential story, and we'll keep tracking every part of it as it develops. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.